Hello everyone, I'm Bruffy1322 and welcome to another video where we're talking about some cars. So Rockstar recently released some new cars to GTA Online in conjunction with the Super Sport Series update, and they've been programmed slightly differently to what we're used to, leading many people to claim that they're bugged since they're not all that quick, the Entity XXR especially, which was expected to be a lot better. But what is it that's actually wrong with them? Well, from a technical and gameplay perspective, nothing. Without these new attributes, they'd still not be very quick cars, but the fact that they've been programmed differently makes them simply just different to what we're used to with cars from this game. Now before we get into it, I just want to have a quick mention that this update brought a few changes and some new bugs as well, such as all player created stunt races being limited to a maximum of 7 laps, and more weather options being added to regular races but not stunt races. But I'm going to be covering all those issues in a future video and trying to get Rockstar to see that. But for now, let's just talk about these new cars and whether they're part of that bug list too. Now to put things into a little bit of perspective, having expensive cars that are slow is nothing new. Just look at the Lynx in the sports class, which is $1.735 million and has woeful performance around a track. And also, cars having good top speed but being terrible around a track is nothing new either. You have to just look at the 811 and the Banshee 900R in the supercars class. They're the top two for top speed, but they're way off the pace for lap time. So if there was nothing different about the way that these new cars like the Entity XXR and the Taipan were programmed, many people would be complaining about them being not very good cars, but there wouldn't be all these cries of them being bugged. And in actual fact, when you have a look at the handling data for these cars, it's not really this new way of programming that's making them slow completely. They're simply slow vehicles in and of themselves. They both, for example, don't have much downforce. The Entity XXR is at 1.75 downforce with the Taipan at 1.25. And when you have downforce values of around 3 for the best supercars, these cars can't even hope to compete in the corners regardless of any of these new handling attributes. So that's something to get out of the way straight away. These cars aren't slow because they're bugged, nor are they slow because of new ways of being programmed, or engine resistance or anything like that. They're just slow. Now I do take some responsibility for mentioning engine resistance in my original testing video of it, to be honest, because it's not something that I should have said, and it's a new attribute, but on further inspection it actually does very little to car performance. So I shouldn't have mentioned it before it was further investigated, but of course it didn't help that, bigger YouTubers just jump on every single word I say. But yeah, there you go. So they're not slow just because of this new way of programming, but they are slightly slower than what they would have been in some circumstances because of it. Now the culprit of this isn't engine resistance, but instead the new advanced flags that have been added to these cars. Now all cars in the game have certain what's called flags associated with them in the handling files of the game that determine various aspects. For example, one flag determines whether a car has tyres can clip functionality, which makes them benefit from off-road wheels, making the ride smoother over bumps. Now there's a lot of these flags already existing in the game, but with this update we saw a new set of flags added to these new cars only. They're under the heading Advanced Flags in the handling files, and if anyone wants to see these details firsthand, I'll leave a link to the relevant spreadsheet in the description. Now the credit goes to Adam10603 from Nodo, who's done some testing regarding all of this and has managed to define some of those new handling flags and what they do. One will make the car have more bouncy suspension. One will cause the car to shift up a gear a lot sooner than usual. And one makes the car hit the rev limiter for a longer time before shifting up a gear. Now most of these new cars have both of those latter two handling flags on them, and together they make the gear changes and the revs of the car vary wildly in comparison to what we're used to. Shifting earlier doesn't necessarily slow things down too much, but hitting the rev limiter certainly does, since the car isn't accelerating as quickly when it's doing that, and every time you go over a slight bump or pothole or curb in the game, it causes those revs to increase, which for these new cars means hitting that rev limiter and actually making them kind of just sit there not accelerating until it decides to change up a gear. These flags are also the reason that none of these new cars can mid-drive speed boost or clutch kick, or otherwise incorrectly labelled as double clutch. So when you're on a city road with a lot of bumps, these cars will actually perform a lot worse than they could as opposed to a smooth road out in Blaine County, for example. But as I mentioned before, even in that area they're not top tier supercars in terms of lap time. But if you do take these cars out in those areas where there's smooth roads, you'll see them behave in a very similar way to just normal cars that we're used to, since those smoother roads help them to build up speed and change gears without constantly hitting that rev limiter too much due to excess bumps in the road. Now, what all of this does is effectively remove curb boosting for these new cars. For those who don't know, curb boosting is the process of increasing the revs of a car by hitting curbs and bumps in the road. Previously, it made you go quicker in terms of acceleration and top speed, but with these new cars, hitting the rev limiter so much on every bump actually hurts you. The X80 Proto has a top speed of 127.5 miles per hour on the highway, but with the use of curb boosting, it can get up to 140 miles per hour in the city. However, the Entity XXR's highway top speed of 128 miles per hour actually drops down to a speed of 118 in the city when you're curb boosting. I'll show examples of this on the screen in a few minutes just so you can see it for yourself, but in a way it's kind of more realistic. If you were driving at high speeds up and over curbs in real life, your revs would be all over the place too. And as I said, these cars act fairly normally on smooth roads. It's just very different to what we've been used to cars doing over the past 4 years. Instead of increasing their speed when hitting bumps in the road, these new cars actually decrease their speed. Now, since Rockstar never go back and change the performance of old vehicles unless they're bugged, it's very unlikely that these mechanics are going to be applied to all cars going forward, completely getting rid of curb boosting from everything. It's also very unlikely that these new cars will be changed as well, since they're not bugged. They're programmed and intended to be like this. What they're essentially doing with this is basically testing. They're testing for future games or even the next GTA. It's going to be likely that they're going to be using the same game engine, so since curb boosting is such an inherent part of the game engine itself, curb boosting will be an inherent part of the next game, unless they program around it, and these cars seem to be the first attempt at doing that. There's no other reason at this stage of the game to add in these mechanics when the cars are already established in the way that they handle. The same was true of Downforce in the Cunning Stunts update. They're basically just trying things out to see what does work and doesn't work, and it'll likely shape the driving mechanics of the next installment. It would be quite nice if they didn't do all of this with multi-million-dollar supercars though, it must be said. One final thing to talk about is specifically regarding the Entity XXR and its performance in different areas. As I said, the smoother the road, the better these new cars drive, so on perfectly flat stunt roads, they're going to be comparatively better, at least when it comes to burning up and maintaining speed. There's lots of little micro bumps on even the smoothest regular road on the game map, which aren't present on stunt track pieces, meaning these cars will be comparatively quicker because they don't have those bumps holding them back, and other cars don't have those bumps helping them. But that doesn't actually mean they're going faster. In actuality, if you take the Entity XXR on a completely flat stunt track road, its top speed is only 122 miles per hour. That's 6 miles per hour less than what it is on a regular road. But this is true of all cars. All cars are actually slower on stunt track pieces than they are on regular roads because of the various different physics surrounding those stunt track pieces. But I'm never going to present anything without examples. So here we have the Entity XXR and the X80 Proto, which are pretty evenly matched in terms of top speed, with only 0.5 mile per hour difference in favour of the Entity, as I mentioned earlier. Take them on a stunt track piece though, where the Entity isn't hindered by the small micro bumps and it's able to pull away slightly, although both are going slower than they were on the highway. Then put them in the city and you'll see that the X80 is able to pull away big time, since it's being helped by the bigger bumps a lot more, and the Entity is actually being slowed down by them. The 2 checkpoints on each of these tracks are the same distance apart, and you can see how much quicker the X80 reaches that second checkpoint in the city in comparison to the highway, and how much slower the Entity in the city reaches that same checkpoint in comparison to when it's on the highway. And this final comparison shows that the cars are in fact slower on stunt road pieces than on regular road, since again the checkpoints you see here are the same distance apart on both tracks, and we see that the Entity and the X80 Proto both reach that second checkpoint later than they do when they're on the highway. And this is why I always talk about testing relevance. Good tests aren't only accurate, but they're also relevant too. Think of the last time that you were in a race that had a 5-mile perfectly flat stunt track piece where you're not turning, going uphill, downhill, or don't have the ability to hit curb boosts on the side of the road. If you're struggling to remember when that was, then what kind of information does testing in that kind of environment give you? The answer is nothing. Knowing that a car reverses quicker than another is useless information unless you're in a race where everybody's going in reverse, and the same is true of many ways of testing cars. Drag testing without using any of the tricks that proper drag racers in the community use, top speed testing on huge flat long pieces of road that you never actually experience. Even my lap time testing is completely irrelevant to you if you're not racing on tracks that have corners. But that's the nature of testing. One single test can't be everything to everybody, and I test the way that I do to try to be as much to as many people as possible. Lap times on a city track and top speeds on a highway is the most general form of testing possible, but it's up to you to determine what's relevant for you and your own circumstances. And that pretty much covers everything. I hope this video has been a help to you to understand what's going on here with these new vehicles and why you might have seen some different results elsewhere. And as always, I'll always be staying on top of all the updates and new cars, testing in the usual way to give you some accurate comparisons. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.